They say history is written by the victors. It is a grand tapestry of triumphs, towering monuments, and eternal glory. But sometimes, just sometimes, the losers leave such a dark, indelible mark that the victors wake up screaming their names for centuries to come. Rome was not just a city. It was an unstoppable machine of conquest, a titan that crushed every crown and every culture in its path. Yet deep in the shadows of the Mediterranean, one man was preparing to do the impossible. Today you won't just witness the strategic life of a general, you will witness how a single man, sheer, unyielding, will brought a superpower to its knees. This is the legend of the ghost of Carthage. This is Histyra. To truly understand the cold, calculated wrath of Hannibal, we must first look at the bleeding scars of his beloved homeland. Carthage was once the undisputed queen of the Silver Seas, a majestic jewel of trade, unmatched wealth, and maritime dominance. But the First Punic War had shifted the world's axis forever. Rome had not simply defeated Carthage, they had humiliated her to her very core. They stripped away her fertile islands, drained her golden treasuries, and left her ancient pride bleeding in the dust of the Mediterranean. For Hannibal Barca, Hannibal's father, every new Roman decree was a poisoned dagger driven deeper into his heart. He watched his city wither and fade under the expanding, suffocating shadow of the Roman eagle. In that heavy silence, a toxic, unyielding hatred began to brew, a fire that peace could never hope to extinguish. In the year 237 BC, Hamilcar decided that his sacred hatred would not die with his generation. He led his young son, barely 9 years old, into the deepest, darkest sanctuary of the Temple of Baal-Hamon. The air inside was thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of ancient oils and the rising smoke of burnt offerings. Hamilcar gripped the boy's shoulder with a hand hardened by 1,000 brutal battles, forcing young Hannibal to look directly into the flickering, violent flames of the sacred altar. There he demanded a promise that would seal the fate of millions yet unborn. The boy did not flinch. His gaze was as cold and unyielding as iron, with a voice steady, enough to chill the very soul. He swore the ultimate oath: "I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome." In that cold, silent temple, the boy vanished. What emerged was Rome's eternal nightmare, a ghost that would haunt their gates for 17 years. By the year 218 BC, Hannibal Barca was no longer just a boy bound by a bloody oath. He was a master of men, a commander of tens of thousands, and the living embodiment of Carthage's vengeance. While the Roman Senate sat comfortably in their marble halls, expecting a predictable war in Spain or the deserts of Africa, Hannibal was planning something that defied every law of military logic. He turned his back on the sea and looked toward the north, toward the jagged, white teeth of the Alps. He would lead his massive host, an army of 38,000 infantry, 8,000 elite cavalry, and 37 colossal African war elephants straight across the most treacherous mountain range in the known world. To the Romans, these peaks were a God-given shield, a barrier no mortal army could ever breach. To Hannibal, they were simply the next step in his long-awaited march toward justice. The ascent was not a march. It was a slow, agonizing descent into a nightmare carved in ice and stone. Hannibal's soldiers, men born under the scorching sun of North Africa and the warm winds of Spain, now found themselves trapped in a vertical, frozen hell. Every single step was a desperate gamble with death. The narrow, crumbling paths offered no mercy. One slip meant a 1,000-foot plunge into bottomless, silent ravines. Horses, terrified by the howling winds, froze where they stood or tumbled into the abyss, taking vital supplies with them. And then there was the sheer silence of the heights, broken only by the screams of the mountain tribes, savage warriors who watched from the shadows, raining massive boulders down upon the exhausted Carthaginian line. Hannibal did not lead from the safety of the rear. He was at the very front, pickaxe in hand, his fingers bleeding and frozen, literally carving a path through solid rock with his own hands. He wasn't just fighting an empire anymore. He was waging a godlike war against nature itself. After 15 days of pure, unadulterated agony, the battered remnants of the army finally reached the windswept summit. But the silence at the top was haunted. The price of Hannibal's ambition was written in the snow. Nearly half of his grand army, his friends, his brothers in arms, lay dead behind him, their bodies destined to be preserved in the ice for eternity. Most of his legendary elephants were gone, their giant carcasses serving as grim monuments to the cost of defying the gods. Yet as Hannibal stood on the jagged edge of the Italian side, his one remaining eye gazing down at the lush, fertile green of the Po Valley, his spirit remained as unbroken as the mountains themselves. He had done the impossible. The shield of Rome had been shattered by sheer will. The storm had finally arrived on Italy's doorstep, and it carried the terrifying name of Barca. The real war was about to begin. The Alps were conquered, but Italy was not. For 2 long and bloody years, Hannibal Barca danced across the Roman countryside like a ghost, haunting their most fertile lands. Every farm burned, every minor legion crushed was a message written in fire. The Roman Senate, fueled by a toxic mixture of absolute terror and wounded imperial pride, finally decided to end the Carthaginian threat once and for all. They raised the largest army in their entire history, over 80,000 elite legionnaires. It was a forest of iron, bronze, and red plumes, marching with a singular, arrogant purpose: to grind the Barca pest into the Italian dust. At a small sun-drenched town called Cannae, under a scorching August sun, 2 worlds finally collided. On one side, the rigid, massive Roman machine. On the other, Hannibal's diverse army of mercenaries, Gauls, Iberians, and Numidians, held together by nothing but the iron gaze of a man who refused to lose. Hannibal knew the mathematics of war were against him, but he understood the psychology of his enemy. He placed his thinnest, weakest infantry in the center, forming a crescent that bowed outward toward the Roman line. As the massive Roman wall charged, Hannibal's center slowly, deliberately retreated. The Romans, sensing a quick and glorious victory, rushed deeper and deeper into the gap. They were walking into the jaws of a titan. Suddenly, the crescent inverted. The trap snapped shut with the sound of 1,000 shields. Hannibal's elite African infantry struck like hammers from the flanks, while his legendary Numidian cavalry circled behind, cutting off the only path to survival. 80,000 Romans were now trapped in a space so tight they couldn't even draw their swords. It was no longer a battle. It was a systematic industrial-scale harvest of souls. When the sun finally set over the blood-soaked fields of Cannae, the Roman Republic lay in literal ruins. Nearly 50,000 Romans had been slaughtered in a single afternoon, a casualty rate so high it remains one of the darkest days in human history. Legend says that as the dust settled, Hannibal's officers collected thousands of gold rings from the fingers of fallen Roman nobles, sending them back to Carthage as a grim, silent proof of their absolute victory. Rome was paralyzed. Their gods had failed. Their legions were ghosts. The road to the Eternal City was wide open, and for one brief, terrifying moment, the fate of the Western world hung by a thread, held in the blood-stained hand of a man who had never forgotten the oath he took as a 9-year-old boy. The ghost was at the gates. The ghost was at the gates, yet the gates remained closed. After the slaughter at Cannae, the world expected Hannibal to march on Rome and burn it to the ground. But Carthage, blinded by internal politics and envy, refused to send the reinforcements he so desperately needed. For 16 long, grueling years, Hannibal remained a guest that Rome could not evict. He dominated the Italian countryside, winning every skirmish, outthinking every general, yet he was a king without a crown. Rome, however, had learned a bitter lesson. They stopped trying to defeat the master. Instead, they began to mimic him. A young, brilliant commander named Scipio realized that to kill the lion, you must burn his den. He took the war to the walls of Carthage itself. In 203 BC, with a heavy heart and a soul filled with what-ifs, Hannibal Barca finally turned his back on the Italy he had terrorized for nearly 2 decades. The son was called home to save a mother that had abandoned him. In 202 BC, on the dusty plains of Zama, the master finally met his mirror image, Scipio Africanus. For the first time, Hannibal faced a Roman who didn't fight like a Roman. Scipio had studied Hannibal's every move, every trap, every trick. He turned Hannibal's legendary elephants into a liability, opening the Roman ranks to let the beasts pass through harmlessly. The battle was a brutal, grinding symphony of iron. When the dust finally settled, the unthinkable had happened. Hannibal Barca had been defeated. Carthage was forced into a humiliating peace, stripped of its navy, its treasury, and its future. The empire that once challenged the world was reduced to a Roman vassal. But for Rome, Even a defeated Hannibal was too dangerous to be left alive. They didn't just want his city, they wanted his head. Hannibal spent his final years as a ghost in exile, wandering from one eastern kingdom to another, always one step ahead of the Roman assassins. But the Republic's memory was long, and their fear was deeper. Eventually, cornered in a small village in Bithynia and unwilling to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, the old lion chose his own end. As he raised a cup of poison to his lips, he reportedly whispered, "Let us ease the Romans of their continual dread and care, since they think it long to wait for the death of an old man." Hannibal Barca died in 183 BC, but he never truly left. He had fulfilled the oath he took as a 9-year-old boy. He had been the deadliest enemy Rome ever knew, not because of his swords, but because he showed the world that even a titan can bleed. The gates of Rome are silent now, but if you listen closely to the wind in the Alps, you can still hear his name. This is the legend of the ghost of Carthage. This is Histyra,